What is up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and we finally got the season finale of The Last of Us last night. Of course, I've watched it and I want to talk about it, but also I kind of want to talk about the season as a whole. So without further ado, let's rock. And as I've mentioned in past videos, The Last of Us video game is one of my favorite video games of all time. And as almost the entire internet is, I am a big fan of Pedro Pascal as well. I was super stoked that he got cast as Joel in this show. So therefore, I've already touched on some of this stuff that I'm gonna bring up in this video. Some of it's gonna be rehashed. However, I have yet to do a episode by episode breakdown, and that's kind of what this video is gonna be. So yeah, some of this will be rehashed, but most of it will be brand new if you've seen some of my other content. That being said, I generally like to keep my reviews as spoiler free as possible. Therefore, I'm not going to touch on the season finale as much as I will the other episodes, just because that just came out and I want to give everybody an opportunity to actually watch it. That being said, everything else is going to be fair game, though I will keep it somewhat spoiler free. And I've been teasing this the last couple of videos, but I was just waiting to see if they could stick the landing. But now that we've gotten the entire first season of The Last of Us, it is easy for me to say that this is by far the best video game adaptation that we have ever gotten. It shouldn't be a super surprise that they were able to pull this off, because Neil Druckmann, the guy that created the video games themselves, also helped create this show. But it is the perfect example. They kind of set the blueprint for all other video game adaptations. This is how you do it. I absolutely cannot stand when someone takes a video game IP and then kind of just does whatever they want with it. The Last of Us showed that what you need to do is take what works in the video game and then kind of fill in the gaps. Because even though The Last of Us is one of the best, if not best, video game stories ever told, there are gaps. Just because the nature of video games, you have to leave room for gameplay. So there's definitely gaps in this story. And I think the show did a phenomenal job of filling those gaps. And that starts with the very first episode. Once you get past the little weird scene at the beginning where they give you a little bit more backstory on how the infection happened, which, side note, they do this again a little bit in the second episode. And it's one of the rare missteps, I think, in this show, because for me, it's never been about how the infection happened. I don't care about how the apocalypse happened. It's about Joel and Ellie. So I feel like spending time explaining that doesn't really matter. And honestly, I guess I'm spoiling a little bit more of the later episodes. It never really matters. So I don't get why they spent time explaining that, because it kind of just slows down the show. However, once you get past that, it's beat for beat exactly what happens at the beginning of the game, except they did fill in a little bit of a gap. Like I said, with Sarah, we get to spend a little bit more time with that character. Therefore, the gut punch at the end of the episode hits just a little bit harder than it did in the game. And that's saying a lot, because I've definitely said this a few times on past videos, but the first 15 minutes of this game, they do more character development than most games do in their entire run. And I was curious to see if the show was able to live up to that hype, and they absolutely knocked it out of the park. So that brings us to episode 2, which, outside of the backstory stuff that I've already mentioned, it's pretty much beat for beat the tutorial of the game. The one big change between the game and the series in this particular episode is they did away with the spores, which I didn't particularly love. I don't care about the spores per se. It's more about the fact that they, instead of having the spores, which honestly makes logical sense because of the way that the infection works with the spores, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in the game. So I appreciate that they kind of did away with it. It's the fact that they kind of gave them this hive mind. I equate it to the Upside Down in Stranger Things, and it doesn't stay very consistent in the third episode. And the reason I say that, Ellie finds us trapped infected, and like a little psychopath, she cuts him before killing him. And I just kept thinking while I was watching this scene, they've already established that they have this hive mind. Wouldn't the cordyceps know where they are? I guess you could argue that they're out in the open. There's not a whole lot around there, so there probably isn't that much infected around. So even if they could communicate, it wouldn't really matter because Joel and Ellie would already be gone. But it's just something that I couldn't get rid of in my mind. So I don't think that it was super consistent. I get what the filmmakers were trying to do to kind of hint at her darker side, especially if you've played the games before, you know some of the stuff that's coming up later, and it's just kind of a hint to the audience of what she's capable of. Honestly, because I couldn't shut the part of my brain off that just didn't think that the cordyceps thing was super consistent, that scene just didn't work for me. Speaking of the third episode, it is the most obvious and best example of taking one of those gaps in the video game story and just expanding on it. And again, the show just absolutely knocked it out of the park. We had 2 action-packed episodes in a row, and the third episode kind of just slowed down the show, but in the best way possible. Bill and Frank's relationship was always hinted at in the game, and I'm glad that they took the time to really flesh out that relationship. And it certainly didn't hurt that there was excellent filmmaking in the third episode. The final scene between the two of them, the window shot, just like the main menu in the game, was pitch perfect. I also loved how the timeline was played with. People like myself who know the game so well just assume that they know exactly what's going to happen, and the fact that they were able to play with the timeline a little bit kind of kept me on the edge of my seat. Now, of course, the goal of this episode is for Joel and Ellie to get the supplies for their trip, and that still happens, but they were able to tell this heartbreaking love story kind of wrapped around the goal of the episode. And the next couple episodes are really Henry and Sam's arc, but it's also about building up that relationship, that daughter-father relationship between Joel and Ellie that we see in the games. It starts off pretty simple with Joel explaining what life was like before the apocalypse. There's that funny joke about how Joel doesn't understand how siphoning gas works. Of course, he eventually teaches her how to hold a gun, which was absolutely adorable. And then the friendship is sealed, like all friendships, with a diarrhea joke. It certainly didn't hurt the fact that Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey absolutely kill it as Joel and Ellie. You really believe in that relationship. I didn't love Bella Ramsey as Ellie at first, but her portrayal as that character really grew on me as the show went along. So let's actually talk about Henry and Sam now. I absolutely loved that they gave Henry this tragic backstory of betraying his group to protect Sam, because it kind of feeds into one of the overall themes of The Last of Us, and that is you are capable of horrible things to protect the people that you love. Henry loves Sam like a son in a similar way that we're seeing Joel is starting to love Ellie as a daughter. And then to actually give Sam the extra layer of being deaf and the fact that they hired a deaf actor to play him is just absolutely perfect. So another big part of episode 5 is the addition of Kathleen, which at first I didn't really love her character. I did appreciate the idea of giving that group a strong leader and an interesting backstory, because it kind of feeds into my overall theme of this season, and that is filling in the gaps from the video game, because that group in the game doesn't really have any backstory. They're more of just a plot device to keep the game going. However, I didn't really think that Melanie Lynskey, the woman that plays Kathleen, was right for the part. The little that we saw her in episode 4 didn't really do a whole lot for me, but she absolutely proved me wrong in episode 5. She was fantastic. And the cherry on top of episode 5 is the fact that we actually got the sniper scene from the game, which is one of my favorite parts of the game, but it's very action gameplay video game heavy, and I didn't know if they were even going to try it, or if they did try it, were they able to pull it off, and they absolutely killed it. It certainly didn't hurt that we got a bloater as well ripping dudes' heads off. But of course, This episode ends with one of the saddest moments from the game, which is saying a lot because there's a ton of sad scenes from the game that are recreated in the series. But what happens to Henry and Sam is definitely atop of that list. It was actually a moment where my wife, who knows how big of a fan I am of the video games, but she's never played them herself, so she was watching this show with me and she started to question why I even like the games. She's like, this is so sad. Why do you play this game over and over and over again? So I'll be a little bit quicker with episode 6. It definitely slows down a bit in this episode, but like episode 3, it does it in the best way possible. We just got one of the more emotional scenes from the game at the end of the previous episode, so it makes sense that they would kind of take a breath. And I loved the opening scene of episode 6. I love the relationship between Joel and Ellie and the older couple. It brought a levity to the series that we hadn't really seen a ton of before, and it just worked coming off that emotional scene from the last episode. I also love that they jumped time, because I was getting a little nervous because there's a lot of time that passes from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, and I was starting to get that in the back of my head, that little voice that was saying, like, are we gonna get to the end of the game in this season? So I definitely appreciated the jump time a little bit. It also showed how Joel and Ellie's relationship was maturing. It certainly didn't hurt that Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey definitely shined during these scenes. I loved them. They were fantastic. And then, of course, we get a big cliffhanger at the end of this episode that really sets up the next episode. So if you've ever played the game, especially the DLC, you know that episode 7 is basically the DLC episode. As soon as I saw that split second in the trailer where the mall just lights up, I was super stoked for that episode. Which, on a side note, that scene where the mall lights up is absolutely breathtaking. I was super excited for this episode. And as a fan of the game, I loved how many Easter eggs from the game were in this episode. Now, every episode had its own Easter eggs in there, but this episode was especially chock full of them. Between the merry-go-round, the photo booth, the Halloween store, even to the masks that they were wearing in the Halloween store, this episode had everything. And the production design was outstanding. I couldn't tell if it was a set that they built or if the characters were actually in a mall, which says a lot. And on a personal note, I'm a huge Mortal Kombat fan, and you see the arcade game in an earlier episode, I think it was episode 3, but the fact that they bonded while playing that game in this show was just a nice personal touch that I appreciated. My only tiny nitpick was the game uses the DLC to kind of show how Ellie kept Joel alive during this period, and the show doesn't really do that. Now, the logical part of me understands why they didn't have Ellie save Joel in the DLC episode, because it kind of ramps up the desperation for episode 8 or the David episode. And as they've done already a couple of times, the show kind of slows down this part. This part is pretty action heavy in the game, but I definitely appreciated that they slowed it down, as I appreciated that they slowed down the show as a whole the last couple of times that I've talked about it. And that's because they were able to give themselves some room to really flesh out some of these characters, especially David. I loved the David character. I loved the character development that they gave this character, because as a leader, you can tell, especially in that Bible reading scene at the early part of the episode, that his followers respect him, but there's also a big part of that where they fear him. And you see some of the things that he is capable of throughout this episode, and you really start to understand that fear. It certainly doesn't hurt that Scott Shepherd, the guy that played David, absolutely killed it. It also doesn't hurt this episode that Troy Baker, the guy that played Joel in the video games, is also a character, a pretty prominent character in this episode. Of course, I'm a fan of him with Joel in the Last of Us game, but I'm also a big fan of him as just many video game characters, but especially Booker DeWitt. From BioShock Infinite, I actually met Troy Baker at Indie PopCon one year, and he signed my Booker DeWitt pop. So obviously I'm a big fan of him. So I was super excited to see him in this episode, and he absolutely killed it. And I loved how towards the end of this episode, you really got to see what Joel and Ellie are capable of to survive and protect each other. I also appreciated that they didn't change the ending. I didn't think they would, but I appreciated that Ellie saved herself. Because in the game, especially the first time you play the game, you just assume the action movie or action video game trope of the man coming to save the girl was gonna happen. And I loved that it didn't happen in the video game and it doesn't happen in the show, that Ellie saves herself, which is just absolutely perfect. The only thing I didn't like about episode 8 was where it left off. So going into this season, I knew that they only had 9 episodes to work with. So when episode 8 ended, despite being one of my favorite, if not my favorite episode of the season, I was like, oh no, they still have a decent amount of ground to cover. Are they going to be able to do that in episode 9? And I was especially nervous when I saw episode 9 was only 45 minutes long, and I got even more nervous when they spent a good chunk of the beginning of that 45 minutes giving Ellie more backstory. Now, I think I'm going to be in the minority here, so just stay with me. I know this is a bit of a hot take. I'm definitely going to be in the minority. I love that Ashley Johnson was in this episode. I don't think that's the hot take. I think everybody's going to agree with that, especially if you're a fan of the game. But I just didn't care that they gave Ellie that backstory, like that immunity. It didn't matter to me. That's not the point of the story. So the fact that they used that time to give her that immunity backstory didn't really matter to me. She's basically just a daywalker. She's just Blade, and that's the backstory. And I just didn't really care. I did like the connection between Marlene and I think her name was Anna, if I remember Ashley Johnson's character from the show. So I did like that dynamic, but for the most part, they spent way too much time giving me backstory that I didn't care about. I know, probably in the minority there. I liked that she was in the show, but I didn't really care about the 10-15 minutes we had to spend giving her that backstory. I was especially nervous when we had about 20 minutes left of the episode and they hadn't really done the hospital stuff yet. And so I was getting really nervous because, again, they left it off on a cliffhanger. I'd been super, super disappointed. Luckily, I think a lot of that mindset was just due to the fact that that hospital part in the game takes a lot longer than it did in the show. I loved how they filmed that last scene with Joel kind of working his way through the hospital. I thought it was brilliant filmmaking. And it took what usually takes me about 30 to 45 minutes, I should say, in the game, and they cut it down to like 3 or 4 minutes. So I definitely appreciate that. I don't want to get too much more into the season finale just because it just came out last night. I want to give people an opportunity to watch it if you haven't already. But like I said earlier, The Last of Us Season 1 is by far the best video game adaptation we have ever gotten, which I know isn't saying a lot because most adaptations are trash, but this is by far the best one we have ever seen. And I think a lot of that has to do with, surprise, surprise, the fact that they let the creator of the games, Neil Druckmann, actually help create the TV series as well. So there was a lot of stuff that worked well in the game, in the TV series, and where they could fill in the gaps, they filled in the gaps. Now, they did add some things, they did tweak some stuff from the game, and most of that worked for me. Some of it didn't, especially the backstory to the infection I didn't think was needed at all. It didn't really fill in anything for me. But for the most part, this was a phenomenal series. It had great production design, great casting. The actors absolutely knocked it out of the park. The action was amazing. Even when they did slow it down, the character development they were able to add really worked for me. So from start to finish, I absolutely loved this season of television. And I think out of 5 stars, I'd give it 4.5. But as always, those are just my opinions. I'd love to hear what you thought of the first season of The Last of Us in the comments down below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate if you smash that like button, as the kids say. Consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. I post weekly gaming related content. So if you like that type of stuff, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy, Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?